there's a zone of compatibility between this democratic socialism slash social democracy and traditional socialism. Both of them are motivated by the same basic principle, which is markets shouldn't run our lives. Markets is not the same thing as capitalism. It's capitalism if you're market dependent. Certain aspects of our lives should be guaranteed to us independently of how we do in the market. The way I would say it is in socialism, society will govern the market. In capitalism, the market governs society. So you shouldn't be afraid of markets. You're going to have to learn to live with them. What you need to figure out is how to point them and craft them in a direction that's consistent with human flourishing rather than sacrificing human flourishing at the altar of the market, which is what capitalism does. That's the way in which democratic socialists, who are actually social democrats, are part of the same family that traditional socialists were in. But actually existing democratic socialism as a movement is a movement for social democracy. Now, are people who come to this movement or the leaders of this movement, are they people who could be hitched to the wagon of more traditional socialism? Yeah. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders would say, hell yeah, if you give me socialism, I'll take it. I think Zoran Mamdani would say the same thing. I don't think there's any tension between what is called democratic socialism and the aspirations of traditional socialists. There are some democratic socialists who are ideologically wedded to capitalism. I don't know how many there are, some percentage. I do believe a lot of the people who come to the DSA, ideologically come to the DSA, would be perfectly happy to be in socialism. I don't think they'll fight against it. So that's where I think is the zone of compatibility and the relationship between the two.
So would the distinction be those who want to move towards a goal where the market is not
In our life.
ruling over society? Because social democrats also kind of, as you said, are working towards that. So it's like, where is that line exactly?
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Vivek Chibber, a guest that many of my listeners requested, and a guest that I think brings a lot when it comes to critiques of the left that are so necessary in a time in which the left is at a crisis point, a low point. The far right's winning everywhere, and despite even the center collapsing, it seems, and the far right disappointing, the left has only made very small gains in very few places. Vivek Chibber is the author of numerous books, such as The Class Matrix, The ABCs of Capitalism, Confronting Capitalism, and is also as a good critique of post-colonialism, which we'll get to later. He's also a contributor at Jacobin magazine. How are you doing today, Vivek?
I'm doing fine, Tony. Thank you.
So the first question is a broad one, which will take us in many different directions. Quite simply, what's wrong with the left today?
The condition of the left is that it's very, very, very weak, organizationally and intellectually and politically. By politically, I mean in terms of the parties or the representative organizations that it has. When you're that weak, the weakness itself creates a lot of problems. And those problems might be the ones you have in mind, like the fact that it's very obsessed with culture and a very, very narrow elite form of race and gender politics and such things. We often focus on those as being at the core of what's wrong with the left, but those are really symptoms. They're symptoms of the fact that by the 1980s, what's called the left had kind of lost its connections to its historic constituency, which was the working class, and it came to be housed in very marginal locations, removed from the sites of power and struggle, like universities and like social clubs. And so naturally, once you're no longer confronting real centers of power, you're overtaken by minutiae and you're overtaken by the interests and the concerns of those people who dominate the left, which is the middle class. That's where we are now. All that is a symptom of the fact that there was a political defeat, a massive political defeat in the 70s and 80s, and we're still living with the consequences of that.
I think many people will already be familiar with your critique of what went wrong in the 60s and the new left versus the old left and the changes in academia and the cultural turn. You've talked about that a lot, so we don't really need to rehash that. I think people could either check what you've already said on that topic. And I've covered it a lot here too, including the professional managerial class. So I think to drive straight into what is the problem with the current power block of the left? Because every movement that tries to be from the bottom up, unless it wants to rely solely on top down elite conflict to determine changes, has to have a power block that forces politicians that it elects to actually do the things that it wants, and also to have a voter base to even get those people into power, right? Today, the left seems to have substituted labor as a key constituency and class politics for a kind of, there's many terms people call it, but I call it popular front of the vulnerable, which is this vague category of marginalized that's vaguely defined. And some have tried to reform this a little bit by adding some intersectionality dressing onto it. What do you think is the problem with the current power block of the left, and how does it build a more robust class politics, which you advocate a lot?
I
Yeah,
think what you're getting at is what's wrong with the political base of the left. I think that's what you mean, right?
it is, but there's
Yeah,
a voter base, right?
right.
What ensures that the changes get done? And part of that was like before with the left strategy was strikes, having a big labor movement that could withhold, its labor power in order
Right.
to, hold the economy essentially
Well,
hostage.
the left has always had a very specific class base, and that been the group, the people who actually produce the wealth of the nation, or you might call the people who produce the surplus that rich people, the wealthy, extract from them. And that's been, depending on where you live, it's been people who are workers or peasants. That's been the traditional base of the left, and those typically are the people who are the most poor. Typically, are the people who have the most difficult situation. Now, that was
Or
from about,
farmers
I'm
in
sorry?
Canada, or farmers as well in Canada,
Yeah.
the
Farmers,
BCF. Yeah.
yes, farmers have typically been part of the class bases of the left. And if you're in the third world, it's been peasants. That was true for about, 100, 120 years until, as I said, these historic defeats of the 70s and 80s when you had the simultaneous dismantling and defeat of trade unions. You had the retreat of political parties and their domestication. By political parties, I mean communist parties and socialist parties. And these had always been the two vehicles that brought workers and peasants together into an organized struggle. What happened, let's say roughly since the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you could say, is that these two vehicles of popular organizing kind of disappeared as effective mobilizers of working people. Either they just were dismantled, or in parts of the social democratic European countries, they became managerial organs. So they still exist, but they mainly function to keep unions and workers in line for profit making. And the result was that this historic class base either became totally fragmented, disorganized, not at all in political institutions of any kind, or it became domesticated and therefore dejected and lost interest in politics. That space in politics that used to be occupied by this class was soon sort of came to be dominated by another class, which is sometimes it's called the professional managerial class, sometimes it's called the middle class. And that is where the left is now. It's mostly among people who are college educated, who work high skilled jobs or professional jobs, and who are living sometimes a precarious existence, but typically an existence of stunted but real upward mobility. Now, if that is the class constituency of what is called the left, then that left is going to reflect the interests, the worldviews, and the aspirations of that class. And that's where we are now. And ironically, the result is that the people who were the historic constituency of the left, which is working class people, find this left really alienating, even toxic, because they're condescended to and talked down to all the time by this left. And the challenge we face now, those of us who still consider ourselves socialists, is to kind of refashion what it means to be a leftist so that we go back to the culture and to the aims of the historic socialists and social democrats who saw workers as their main constituency and tried to craft a culture and a political strategy that appealed to the workers.
So how does it do that? One, to win back the workers, but also to organize them, right? Because that's what I meant by the twofold question of, on the one hand, they seem to lack the voting base even of workers. So for example, like right-wing parties across the world seem to be winning the votes of the working class. And this was like a long developing trend that Thomas Piketty had analyzed, quite far back with the Brahmin left, merchant rights terms. But the right, of course, doesn't organize the workers. It doesn't promote unionization. So it just kind of uses them as a plebiscite. How does the left, one, win workers as in terms of support and also organize them in an age where we have a fundamentally different economy, a globalized economy that has made organizing much harder, given the lack of leverage workers have due to capital flight, the ability for capitalist firms to move their capital elsewhere easily. So in such circumstances, how can we reverse course?
Well, there's a general and a more specific way to approach this question. The general one we have answers to, the specific ones we don't have yet any answers to. But unless you do the general thing, you'll never figure out the specific thing. So here's what the general thing is. You organize the workers by, it's very simple, you just go to where they are and you live amongst them, you work amongst them, you spend your time with them, you figure out what it is that their main concerns are, and you try to make yourselves relevant to them so that they can see that what you propose and what you're fighting for is going to align with their own interests and their own needs. So, generally speaking, the first thing you have to do is you need to have a political party and a political organization that lives and breathes amongst the workers rather than going touring in working class neighborhoods to go canvassing or door knocking or leafleting or something like that. The best examples we have of this are the parties of the 1910s and 20s and 30s, whether they were communist parties or social democratic parties. Those were all parties that were primarily staffed by working class people themselves. They had some middle class people in them who would maybe be involved in starting the organizations themselves, in getting them off the ground. But very quickly, they made it their mission to go and house themselves in working class areas, get jobs in the industrial plants, in the warehouses, in the docks where the workers were, and start talking to them and figuring out how to bring them all together. Now, I'm saying that it seems obvious, but this is the biggest weakness of the left right now. Is it's mostly middle class people who don't really get out of their own class environment, and that's understandable. It's very hard to go and leave your environment and to get a room somewhere in a slum or to work at a factory or an Amazon warehouse or something like that. But if you don't do that, nothing else will work. So the first challenge is to build an organization which places itself in the same conditions that workers are living in and then starts recruiting those people into the organization. That's the first step. Once you've done that, you come to the more specific question, which is okay, how do we adapt an organizing strategy that is tuned and consistent with the conditions today, which, as you say, are so different? It's not just the outsourcing, it's not just the globalization. They're different from 100 years ago in many, many ways. The size of the establishment where you're working, the kinds of monitoring that they do, the way in which there's layers upon layers that connect workplaces together, separately, whereas earlier you used to have those same layers inside the one building. You'd have the assembly people, the manufacturing people, the painters all in one building. Now that's outsourced to many different ones. You used to live near the workplace. Now you drive to the workplace and you're living very far away from it. All of these things are very different from 100 years ago. And we do not have an answer to that particular question, which is how you organize them once you're there. We haven't figured that out. That's the biggest challenge. That challenge is downstream from the prior one, the general one, which I said, first you got to actually go there. You need political organizations that are actually committed to identifying this constituency as their main constituency, and then going out there and living with them, being with them, breathing the same air that they do. I'm pretty confident that once we do that, once you get enough people doing that, we'll figure the other stuff out. Just as a historical reference, in the 20s and 30s, when the left really got going, when socialists and communists really got going in the United States, in Europe, they saw their condition as much the same as ours, which is it was only recently that capitalism had come to these gigantic plants, which brought under one roof thousands upon thousands of workers. Up until the 1920s, most industrial establishments were quite small, and they were organized along craft lines. When these new establishments came up in the interwar period, organizers, trade unionists said, "Oh my God, how are we ever going to organize these guys? These factories, we've never seen anything like it before." But once they were physically implanted in those workplaces, they figured it out. And I think the same thing will happen here. Our biggest challenge right now is to let the left to stop condescending to workers and patronizing them and start seeing them as the main constituency rather than something they're kind of condescending to. But once we get past that, I think the other stuff will follow. It won't be easy, but it'll follow.
What role do you attribute the education divide to that condescension? Because I think that's massive. In
I
the
mean, it's relevant.
education,
I think it's exaggerated.
education seems to predict voting now. Like even as as one of the biggest predictors of voting patterns, and that's so different socialization. I think is what breeds that sort of condescension or the out of touchness, as well as I think urban and rural divides. And
Yeah.
if you
I
count
mean, let's
urban
take it one at a
suburban
time
divides,
because you're
Mhm.
listing a lot of factors. Education is relevant, but it's not decisive. A lot of the people who one would call the working class are people with degrees, college degrees. And they are things like school teachers, they'll be healthcare workers. Some of them will be people working in the auto plants, some of them in aeronautics. And they are not the people you think of when you say educated, college educated people are condescending to the working class. It is true that having a college degree is a good predictor of elections, but elections are a very small part politics. And it's one of the biggest problems in the current left is that it's obsessed with elections and it's obsessed with opinion surveys. These are very imperfect things. Bernie Sanders has a very good approach to all this, which everybody should emulate. He takes opinion surveys as a interesting little data point, but that's all, nothing more. So suppose your surveys tell you that college educated people are not interested in what the traditional left is interested in. Well, fine, but the left never took education as the marker of who it's trying to organize. It took your relationship to the means of production, how it is that you go about earning your income. Some of those people will have college degrees, a lot of them won't. You're going to organize the people who have an interest in social democratic and socialist politics. You're not going to look at degrees for that. You're going to look at people, how they go about earning their living. That being the case, your first challenge is to say, who are the workers? Not who are the educated, but who are the workers? And then you go about and say, how do we appeal to them? Now, once you figure that out, you'll also see that some of them vote and some of them don't. That's irrelevant. Yes, you're right that a lot of the college educated people condescend to the working class and they dominate politics. But in the United States, in electoral politics, about 40% of the electorate doesn't even vote. And most of that electorate is workers. So it's just not that important. In my opinion, college versus non-college, it explains something, which is, like you said, the condescension. A lot of the college educated population does occupy elite positions, is in the middle class. And historically, the middle class has always kind of had a patronizing attitude to workers. That's true. But the fact that education is a predictor of elections is salient, but it's not decisive because only about 60 to 55 to 60% of the electorate votes in the first place.
Right. We do also see these divides in Europe pretty strongly that even seem to be pretty heavy before a lot of these debates kind of came to North America. But would you also say that, like, part of, I think that's a good point you brought up, though, about not all college educated people are what we think of. When we think of someone who is condescending to the working class, we think of like a poli-sci grad, not so much like a technical expert. We
Yeah.
think of someone studying the social sciences. And I think that's very particular. And I would be interested to see like more research that factors in like what people study, rather than just degrees. But also, I think a big factor of the college degrees is not just that they are of a different class, because in a literal sense, they very well are working class, but many have different aspirations, right? Which is the aspiration to be essentially something above the working class in large part, right? Which is why you get the kind of fallen professional elite overproduction tendency when, there have been a lot of measured cycles by which when you have an overproduction of people who are educated but not enough jobs to fill, you get a rise of like discontent, but a particular kind of discontent. And Musal Garbi talked about that in his We Have Never Been Woke book. Do you think that the current, like, because I think that's a big part of it, is this discontent. But if we continue a declining economy where it becomes clear and clear that it's actually harder it's not going to, like, jobs won't be guaranteed with having a college degree, that potentially a lot of these college educated aspiring professionals may be more likely to have solidarity with the working class.
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt about it. In fact, they will become members of the working class themselves. They're going to be very highly educated working class people who are, in a sense, working below their station. And they'll be working jobs that 20, 25 years ago, you wouldn't have had a college educated person working. That's going to happen. And that's going to straighten them up really quickly. That's going to make them change their attitude towards what they consider to be the unwashed masses. There's no doubt about that. But even right now, we're seeing what is the Zoran Mamdani base? Some of it is people who are kind of culturally left and they like him. They like the fact that he has an exotic sounding name and they like the fact that he eats shawarma and things like that. And they think that makes him cool. But there's a material base to all this, which is that the younger people in their 20s right now, who, as you say, are aspiring to better stations, even if they get jobs that are commensurate with their skills, those jobs are being kind of downscaled. They're coming without benefits. They're coming with a salary that is not going to enable them to get secure housing and secure healthcare. So there's a material basis for even these people who rhetorically, in many ways, might be kind of intersectional and patronizing towards the working class and all that. But they do kind of comprise a social base, a class base of the more educated workers and the kind of lower ends of the aspirant middle class. That can be a secure foundation for building a socialist or a working class movement. Not because they're culturally left, as the commentators all like to say, but because they are, in fact, materially driven to left wing politics and they have an interest in it. We saw this as early as 2016 when this demographic, the younger sections of the professional classes, came to Bernie Sanders. They did it for a large number of reasons, but a very, very strong reason was they saw the lives ahead of them and they saw that we're not going to be able to do as well as our parents did. And so we need to have socialized healthcare. We need some kind of public transportation. We need some kind of subsidized education for at the higher levels. Those are all material interests that they have. I do think that our slow growth capitalism is going to attract more and more elements of that more skilled working class and downwardly mobile middle class. And that's fine. That you need that. No movement in this country for a social democracy or for socialism can confine itself just to blue collar workers or workers. There just aren't enough of them in the country. You're going to need a section of the middle class to come to you. they will stop condescending once there's an actual left that actually educates them. One reason they're so the way they are is they take these idiotic courses in their universities, all of which tell them that workers are like this, that the poor are like this, that the real action is with the most marginal, with the most exotic, with the people with the weirdest sounding names. They come to politics with those burdens, and it takes a while to wash all that away.
That brings us to one of the questions I was going to ask about a class coalition for socialism in the 21st century being beyond just like typical blue collar workers. This sort of image we have, and a lot of people recognize that, but recognize that for a long time, that coalition can't be just limited to that. But the answers people have given to that have often been, right, like this sort of vague, marginalized category that, intersectionality is kind of the left's solution to all problems, like that. Okay, if we just like add class to this other equations of like race, gender, then you can have a kind of rainbow coalition based on that. But what role do you see for like in concrete alliances between workers, skilled workers, professional skilled workers, and also small business owners? Because you alluded to, you know between the solidarity between educated workers and blue collar workers, white collar workers and blue collar workers. But what about, you could say producers, people who derive most of their income from labor, and even if they own a little capital, they still are primarily laboring most of their lives, and as opposed to people who derive most of their income from the collection of rents based on capital they own, whether it be property, right, or stocks, etc.
A big role. Yeah, like I said, so look, right now, people who are called working class, people whose income depends on going out and selling their labor power, it comprises about, depending on how you measure it, 60 to 68% of the occupational structure, which means anywhere from a third to upwards of 40% of the occupational structure is not workers. So anytime you're thinking of building a movement for egalitarian agendas and social democracy, you're not going to get every single worker, which means you're really talking about now, if you're lucky, you'll get about 60 to 70% of the working class vote. You'll get a big chunk of them organized into unions, but then you're still stuck with about half the population that is not in your political coalition. You're going to have to bring some of them in. This has always been true. It is never that there was never any left-wing movement anywhere in the world that was exclusively a movement of workers and peasants. They always brought in middle class elements in some way or form. So how do you do it? Well, intersectionality isn't going to get you there, because all intersectionality tells you is there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the world, and there's lots of bad things, and they all matter. That's it. That's literally the theory. There's a lot of bad things. All of them matter. Yeah, there's race, but there's also gender, there's sexuality, there's class, there's disability, there's all kinds of things. That is the absence of a theory. That's not a theory. What is it then that gives you a framework for understanding this? The framework is you need to have an alliance of different groups, all of whom suffer in some way because of capitalism. But that alliance is not an intersectional alliance. Intersectionality tells you bring them all in, it's a big tent, they all do their thing, and you stitch it all together into one big movement. The only way to do it, if you're going to be a movement for socialism, is if labor's and working class interests hegemonize, set the agenda for all the others. Now, what does it mean to say that labor sets the agenda for like race politics? Well, you approach it with the understanding that there's no such thing as race politics. There's no such thing as gender politics. There's a race politics of rich minorities. There's a race politics of poor minorities. Same thing with gender. These are not homogenous blocks, which means that there's a difference between how working class women view the issue of gender and how working class black and brown people view the issue of race compared to the richer constituents in those communities. Intersectionality systematically obscures this. So what you need to have is a class agenda that addresses exploitation of workers, but also the added oppression that working class women or working class minorities face because of their race and because of their gender. Once you do that, you're going to get a coalition of people that is taking up all the salient issues in our political economy of race, gender, and class, but in a way that is mutually consistent. And once they get real mobilization going, they will draw in middle class elements who do not directly suffer exploitation, but because of neoliberal capitalism, suffer insecurity, insufficient healthcare, insufficient childcare, and they will be drawn to it because the way in which these issues have been articulated speak to them. But if you let them hegemonize it, if you let the middle class hegemonize race and gender, what you get is today's race politics, today's gender politics, which calumniates poor people, including women, including blacks, including Latinos, and which sees the struggle for egalitarianism and universal rights as a distraction. It's the leftists are often told, are accused of taking race and gender as a distraction. That has never been true. It's middle class race and gender politicians that take redistribution as a distraction and as an insult. So if you solve the problem of bringing in women and minorities on their class interests, you will also solve the problem of their racial and gender interests. But that requires a class perspective. Intersectionality has literally nothing to offer there.
It seems we're in an age of floating signifiers for right and left liberal populism. The left populism has relied on, in a kind of unironic way. I mean, kind of, Jordan Peterson and these right wing commentators, they love to act like, you know, the left is all Marxist today. And they say, oh, they reframe thing to class as oppressor versus the oppressed. And in some sense, they are kind of right in terms of what this like PMC professional liberal left does in terms of like framing in terms of oppression versus domination. And the rights master signifier is like the people versus the elites. And that's good for winning votes as plebiscites, but not really concrete in, organizing people. Hence why, of course, it's not a surprise why Trump has got, rolled back Medicaid or Medicare and food stamps. So, what would a more concrete coalition be based on? Because we did allude to this fact that not just now, but throughout the left's history, it never was just based on one class, the working class. You mentioned the peasants, that itself was a huge alliance. But in the Western countries, we don't really have a peasantry. So that means we have to look at the professional class and the small business owners and the farmers who, if we're being real, which is why a lot of people are skeptical, a lot of Marxists, unfortunately, are very skeptical of any kind of alliance with these groups because they point out one truth, which is there are antagonistic relationships, interests at play with, let's say, small business owners and workers in terms of wages, for example, right? Like, it's kind of obvious one. Which leads me to think, is it really just capital versus labor, or is the primary contradiction by which class conflict is to be based on should be, those who pay rent and those who collect it? That's what I've become increasingly convinced by, because while small business owners own capital, while a lot of professional workers have a 401k, are they really capitalists?
No, of course
I
not.
mean, they own most of their income comes from labor. So the idea of like capital versus labor, I think we should look at it in terms of really, because labor is more than just whether you own capital or not. It's whether most of your income comes from the labor, which this might seem like something obvious that we should build alliances with these other groups, these other classes. But for a lot of Marxists I talk to, it's not. They say, no, what we need is it needs to be an alliance with like workers or the kind of lumpen workers
I don't
or the
know who these
professional workers, right?
Marxists are.
That's accepted. That's obviously accepted with Zoran Mamdani, right? Like he did do very well. But I think the small business owners and farmers are what's lacking the most. And we see that with the left seemingly everywhere. It just can't win the votes of those people because I think it doesn't embrace policies that aren't exactly like overtly beneficial to them.
There's small business owners are of two kinds. There's the ones that rely overwhelmingly on their own labor. We call those owner-operators. And there's the ones who employ some number of workers. For the ones who employ some number of workers, there's two kinds. There's the ones who rely exclusively on the workers to get all their tasks done. They kind of sit back and the workers do all the work. And then there's small business owners who work alongside their labor force. Of these three groups, the owner-operators and the ones who work alongside their labor force don't have any antagonistic relationship to the left.
Why aren't they voting, though? Why aren't they voting for...
Look, if you're taking voting as the test for people's interests, you're going to have a lot of trouble because voting is a very complicated phenomenon. And people vote the way they do for many, many reasons, including, so in the United States, there's two parties to vote for. Both of them are bourgeois parties. What can you infer from who voters are voting for when they look at them and they see neither of these parties represents me? So I'm going to have to choose on some other criterion as to what's preferable to me, which is oftentimes some kind of cultural criterion and some kind of thing about nationalism or something like that. Unless you have a proportional representation system in which an actual left-wing party can present alternatives, looking at voting patterns as evidence for class consciousness or for people following their interests is a very, very fraught exercise. I just wouldn't even pay any attention to it.
Right. Well, I'm thinking precisely of Europe. So it seems like
Europe has many kinds of electoral systems. Some are proportional. They're all parliamentary. Some of them are proportional representation, and some of them are single-member districts, like winner take all. It very much depends on which European country we're talking about.
So the ones that I'm more familiar with are just France, Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, and in which, and that seems to, and England, but England's of course not really proportional. The left's, like, the farmers are protesting against the left, it seems, and are voting right, and workers are also voting right. And I think when that happens, it's like, left-wing parties do exist. I mean, in England, I know England's not proportional, but Jeremy Corbyn was like a democratic socialist candidate and lost in a lot of traditionally like labor strongholds, or even Canada, which also is not proportional, but still significant, where we had the trucker convoy. I think that's actually one of the most glaring examples of the contradiction I'm talking about, where the trucker convoy happened, and what was the left's response to it? I mean,
Labor is a
if
thoroughly
we're being
neoliberal
frank here,
party.
we might not think that they're traditionally socialist, but if you ask like the average person, I mean, it's like
Yeah, but
left
that's the
and
point.
right.
If you're trying to make inferences about people voting on their class interests
Mhm.
based on what is actually available to them, and what's
Sure.
available to them uses the word left wing, but in substance offers these people absolutely nothing, then on what grounds can we say their refusal to vote for these parties is a refusal for what you might call the left? Your initial question presumed that workers' interests are something we can sensibly talk about objectively, and that the word left attaches to those interests in some objective way. But the parties you're talking about have no connection to the left as a historical formation, even though they continue to use the word left.
Not
Should
even
it
Jeremy
then
Corbyn?
huh?
Not even Jeremy Corbyn or
Of course,
Mélenchon?
Corbyn, yeah, but then you have to look at the way in which the campaigns in that election were carried out by his own party, which we now know spent millions and millions of pounds destroying his campaign. So if the party that's called the left-wing party undermines its own campaign, presents its main candidate as an anti-Semite and as a troglodyte, what on earth do you expect will happen? You have to be very careful in the inferences you make in people's voting choices in today's world, when nothing like that, there is no party in Italy, in France, in Germany, or in England which presents a traditional left platform. So what do you expect workers to
Well,
do? They're going to vote in all kinds of confused ways.
Well, Germany's party that's literally called the left, Die Link, right? It calls itself democratic socialist. It proposes a wealth tax. It says it supports unions.
Yeah, most of its
That
campaigning is around cultural issues. It's only now
Well,
in the most
there
recent
there
election.
you're getting at, so that's what I'm getting at. I would say they are failing at something. So what I'm trying to say is there are left-wing parties and they are failing, but why are they failing? And I agree with you on that, like the kind of
Okay,
campaigning
so
of
there's two
cultural
separate
issues.
questions here,
But
Tony. You can ask
it's
why
not
are
like,
left-wing parties failing, and you can ask
because
why are voters not voting on their interests. The voters are voting on the interest as best they can because they see a lot of slop out there, and they choose the least sloppiest thing they can find to vote for. The parties are very carefully presenting platforms that appeal to the wealthier sections of the population, but they call it left-wing platforms.
Hmm.
These are two separate questions. Parties are setting the agenda, and you can ask, why is their agenda so crappy with regard to working class interests? And there's very good answers for that. The fact that workers now vote in what to many analysts look like that's confused, why are they voting for parties that are not actually left-wing? That's a separate question. That has to do with what information they have available to them, what choices they have available to them, and what time they have to sift through all the options. I don't think it's any surprise at all that workers vote for crappy parties right now because
Well, especially the far right. Like it's the AFD who's been winning the working class en
yeah,
masse. You know, it's
because
like
that's the only one that's putting up concrete economic demands. It's an irony that parties that call themselves left tend to steer away
well,
from concrete economic demands,
like what specifically?
like people's wages, like they take up the immigration question, and workers feel that the only way we'll be able to save our social welfare state and the only way we'll be able to save our jobs and our wages is by by stopping the flow of immigrants. This is what they're told by the media. This is what they're told by the parties. And they say, okay, what I want, my real interest isn't to hold on to my wages and to hold on to my job. And if it's the immigrants who are threatening it, this is what these parties tell me, then fine. I'm going to go and try to stop the immigrants. What's surprising in that?
Well, the left-wing parties try to appeal to the workers' interests without addressing immigration at all. So it's one thing to not, vilify immigrants themselves. It's another thing to support open borders like the De Linke does, right?
Yeah,
That's
I
kind
would I would question whether left-wing parties are trying to appeal to workers' interests. Now, Die Linke is a partial exception to this only in the last 2 years. All these left-wing parties in Europe, you mentioned Europe as a whole, what they're mostly trying to do is win an election. They're not trying to build or consolidate a class base for themselves. They try to win an election. That means their horizon is 2 years to 4 years. And to win the election, they hire consultants. And the consultants tell them, well, we've done a lot of focus groups, and here's what's going to work. What's going to work to bring whom? Something called the voters. These parties have no commitment to one or another constituency within the voters. They have a commitment to winning elections. And so they package their message based on who's going to turn out to vote and who's going to be consistent with what we're trying to do. That means it's going to be some mishmash of middle class, college educated, some workers, and the historic sort of commitment of the left, which was not just to win elections, but to secure an anchor within their targeted constituency, is now gone. There isn't a single left-wing party, not even Die Linke, right now in Europe that's trying to do that. Doesn't exist.
there's a large part in which I agree with you, in the sense that when I look around the left, and we talk about like this traditional left that you're talking about, which we can maybe get to periodization as to how you view like what is the new left, the old left, and what is left today exactly. I don't see anything at all resembling the old left. The closest that I've seen, or even, well, I would say that what we call the old left was the new left, kind of like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is kind of like the last new leftist in the sense that he still has like, that traditional social democratic roots, as opposed to and you see it when how he talked about borders in 2016. He had a position that was very in line with like what the leftists used to think was common sense, but the left now is something very different. I'm trying to really get at like, if the left, what you would want to see is, an authentic class-based left is just nowhere to be seen. Why is that? At some point, maybe is that not due to like a material reality, right? Rather than just an
I mean, as I
ideological.
said, when I answered your very first question about the problem of the left, this is the consequence of the political outcomes in the 70s and 80s when socialist, communist, and labor parties tried to deal with the economic situation and the economic crisis of the time, and they lost out to whether you're talking about the British Labour Party, the Swedes, the Americans, what you see happening is the same thing everywhere, which is the part of the new left that wanted to continue the project of the older left, which is to build a socialist movement, lost out politically. They lost out to business representatives, to business parties, and to what you might call the right wing of the social democratic parties. They lost. All of these parties now veered towards neoliberalism, all of them, even the Swedes. So that the traditional social democratic left lost its anchor, lost its moorings. It didn't have anywhere to go inside political organizations. The only remnant of the old left now was the trade unions. And the trade union, if you look at union density across Europe and the United States, between 1980 and now, there are only like 2 or 3 countries that have managed to maintain anything like the density that they had in the 1970s. Everywhere, it's been a downward slope. So now you've got political parties that lose their connection to a trade union movement. The trade union movement itself shrinks in size. All you have now is certain words, signifiers, like you said, leftism, progressivism, radicalism. Well, those words are now going to take on a new meaning because the people carrying those signifiers now belong to a new class. It's the professionals, it's the college educated, more skilled workers, it's the middle class, it's the academics, and it's the nonprofits. They now inject these words with an entirely new meaning, which is basically whatever pisses off middle class people. If I have a grouse, I'm oppressed. If I'm unhappy, I'm oppressed. And my oppression is no more or no less important than what workers go through. That becomes the left. That's why it's intersectional. Who's to say that class is more important than, say, disability or race? If you occupy a privileged position in society and you're unhappy about the racial discrimination that you're facing, you're going to prioritize that and call it radical, call it left, to the detriment of what the traditional left's concerns were, which is the issues facing the vast majority of the population. So the word left ceases to have any meaning. The parties that are parties of the left now espouse and project these more privileged people and their interests and their concerns, but they still call it left wing. Now they come to the voters, working class voters, and say, vote for us, we're a left wing party. But this left wing party is saying literally nothing that's of interest to the vast majority of the voters, working class voters. So they go, I don't know, maybe I'll vote for the right wing guy. That's where we are. That's the material basis of the disintegration of the left. The material basis is you lost politically, your traditional social base was unmoored from these political organizations, and then the political organizations underwent a strategic and ideological transformation. The words remained left, progressive, radical, but they have no meaning anymore.
Is there a kind of PMC leftist phenomenon in India that you're
Oh, yeah.
aware of? Because
Absolutely.
one thing I've wondered is why there doesn't why Modi just always seems just continually
Well, that's a
winning.
different matter. We'd have to go into the deep history of Indian politics there. Let me answer your narrower question, which is
Yeah.
India's gone through the same, this is true in, I would say, 95% of the global south now. All their communist parties, their left parties collapsed after the 1990s. Now, that's important because whereas in Europe you had a strong trade union movement and you had left-wing parties, in most of the global south, you never had very strong trade union movements because they have this gigantic reserve army of labor. And the vast bulk of the urban labor market is what's called the informal sector. Tiny little jobs, what we call gig jobs today. Never organized, never bought into unions because it's impossible to organize them. So the organized labor movement only ever represented about 8 to 10 to 15% of the labor force. There's some exceptions to this, maybe Brazil, maybe Chile, but these are exceptions. So the left was overwhelmingly the communist parties, just the parties. But after 1991, most of these parties went into decline or just collapsed. So by the early 2000s, what you have is now a collapse of the traditional left and where radical rhetoric and politics is mostly taken over by middle class people, not so different from here. Not surprisingly, by the 2010s, if you go to South Africa, if you go to South Asia, if you go to Latin America, what you find as the representative of radicalism is post-colonial theory, not socialism. It's been a devastation.
I want to ask, what if there's like specific examples of like post-colonial theory? Because the tricky thing is a lot of people might think they oppose this, but there's a lot of post-colonial thinking that uses class language, right? So it's not necessarily oblivious to it, but they will use class while ultimately totally removing the epic theory of history that would come with, Marxism. Like if you'll see like a rejection of, you know, enlightenment in on behalf of, like against Eurocentrism, or you get what I mean. They were using, this idea, like actually you give this example of, developmentalism sort of being like seen as like a, construct by the post-colonial thinkers, and how yeah. Is there examples you would be comfortable giving? Because I know a lot of academics are reluctant to talk about other academics.
No, I mean, I named them in the book, so why not name them now? You have people like Partho Chatterjee saying in The Nation and Its Fragments that the very idea of modernization, of developing your economy, if you're a post-colonial country, a newly independent country, as in Africa or as in South Asia, the very idea of developing them was a kind of a Western norm that was internalized by these elites. And so it was something that was a symptom of a kind of brainwashing that Europe has done of non-European countries, where the governors, the politicians governing these countries internalized it because they were Western educated and they had imbibed socialism and Marxism. So they embark on modernization. And the implication there is that modernization, the idea that you should modernize, develop your economy, was not an imperative. It was not something you had to do for real economic reasons, but it was a kind of a conceit. You did it because you were walking around influenced by all these Western notions. That's one example. The obvious answer to that is this is, of course, untrue. These countries had to develop precisely because they were coming out of colonialism and they had been impoverished by colonialism. And the millions upon millions of people in these countries that fought for independence, what did they fight for? They fought for having better standards of living. This was just obvious. They wanted to have decent livelihoods. They wanted better wages. They wanted land reform. They wanted healthcare. There's no way to give them that except through development. So the fact that it's happening everywhere should be a suggestion that it's not because you're brainwashed by the West, it's because there are real pressures on you to do it. Another example is Dipesh Chakrabarti has this book on the Bengali working class, in which he says that these workers did not understand Western conceptions of interests and of struggle. And things like trade unionism and fighting for workers' rights, these were European conceptions. Workers didn't have these conceptions. Furthermore, he says the very work relations in these companies, like using physical violence against the workers, like managers beating them, like managers depriving them of their rights. This was unknown in the West because the West is built on notions of rights, individual contracts, respect for others. But what you have in colonialism is workers being treated like shit consistently. That means it's not a real capitalism. This is him using words like capitalism. It's not actual class relations. This is uniquely Eastern. Now, the truth is, the history of work relations in the West is a history of violence, of intimidation, of bullying, of all the sorts of things he says only exist in the East. So both of these are examples of how there's this unbridgeable divide that these theorists build up between the East and the West, so that the East is presented as somehow unique, fundamentally different. Of course, once you do that, the very idea of having international working class movements, of having workers cooperating across cultures, just disappears. And that's why it's so pernicious. There have been plenty of post-colonial theorists who said the very idea of human rights is a Western notion. Therefore, the idea of human rights should be abandoned by the East. What a bizarre notion. How can you fight for Palestinian rights unless you say their right to self-determination is part of a universal right to self-determination? So you can get plenty, one example after another, but it's a bankrupt theory. I think it's mostly now, it's seen its day, it's gone. It'll still be around like a zombie because there's lots of money in it. People have staked their careers on it. But in the 90s and 2000s, this was identified with radicalism. That's never going to be true again. It's going to be identified with kind of pig-headedness and intellectual corruption.
That Palestine example you gave, I see it actually a lot in the anti-imperialist activism, this sort of thinking. I've heard a fair amount of activists actually unironically say that appealing to the law is pointless because at the end of the day, the law is constructed by the West and has a bias towards white people. And I'm thinking, well, what else do you have? How are you
Exactly.
supposed to advocate for self-determination other than universal values? And it's
Exactly. No,
absurd.
you're
But we,
absolutely right. It's disgraceful. But it's just a show. This is all a show. If you look at the Palestinian movement itself, it's replete with talk of rights, humanity,
Mhm.
decency, universalism. It's just a clown show on campuses that does this, and it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. This left is on its way out. This particular left.
I hope so. But we see a leak out in just like the way people talk about East and West, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
like, in the very idea of the West is this bloc that is supposedly only supporting Israel because of its colonial ideology, right? And not other aspects. It's just very annoying. But I want to change the subject real quick while we have time because you wrote a whole book on capitalism, the ABCs of capitalism, and
That's called Confronting Capital. The ABCs were pamphlets, and
yeah,
then we put them together into a book called Confronting Capitalism.
right, with Verso, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the question as to what capitalism is surprisingly not as easy to answer as a lot of people think it is, because a lot of people say they're anti-capitalist, right? But it's not
Yeah.
clear what they mean. They might just be anti-bourgeois. What is capitalism? Because I think that informs what socialism.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what
Right.
informs what socialism is.
Capitalism is simply a system that has two characteristics. I would say three characteristics. One is productive assets are privately owned. You have absolute property rights in those assets. Secondly, that those assets are used for profit maximization and not just breaking even. To survive, all these companies have to maximize profits. And thirdly, that in order for such a system to persist, the vast majority of the population is entirely dependent on the market for its own livelihoods. You have to sell in order to buy. For any of the goods that you need, you have to first find money for yourself. In order to find money, you got to sell something. And for most people, it means selling their labor power. That's what they have to sell. So if you have a system in which productive establishments are privately owned, they employ people for wage labor because those people are market dependent, and that those establishments are driven by profit maximization to the detriment of everything else, that's capitalism.
When did capitalism begin? It's kind of like asking when did the Soviet Union fall, or whether the Soviet Union was
Yeah, no,
socialist.
we know when it began. It began in northwestern Europe, somewhere around the 16th century. Potentially, there's a possibility it appeared in the Low Countries in Holland and Denmark earlier than that. But for sure, in England, it's on stable ground by the early 1500s. That much is quite clear now.
Yeah, I also think it started in England. I take Ellen Wood's view actually, but I think there's like a bunch of minutiae as to when it started, but it is and it does factor in an importance when people talk about socialism, because I want to ask you what your vision of socialism is. If you've been enjoying this podcast episode so far, then you can listen to the rest of it on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you get access to the Backroom exclusive podcast, over 80 exclusive episodes, and some of the best conversations I have been on Patreon in the Backroom. I think it's well worth it, and it's also a way you can support the channel. It's how this show stays running. We have no sponsors. You also get access to the Discord where you can chat with others in the community. We have very vibrant debates, share interesting ideas, and I chat with people all the time there. See you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.